So to demonstrate adding web push or push notifications, recall that, of course, last term we made our medical office example into a progressive web app, and that's the first requirement in order to do this. But I'm taking the solution from our last learning moment where in learning moment 7, among other things, as we were setting up our ability to track staff, employee, volunteer, whatever you call it, we go with employee. We did add some of the classes planning ahead for push notifications. So that's one reason why we'll see that we have a subscription model and so on. But at the top of my copy paste file here for 8.1, you'll see that I actually added a couple of extra users here. I'm seeding, I just used myself. Sorry, it's not that I'm egotistical, at least, well, I don't think I am, but I added myself here with the email. And remember, that's one of the key points. So we're using a common, unique required property to relate the record in the identity system to our employees, right? So DSAV out in Niagara College, and so in application DB initializer, I've also created an identity account for the exact same email address, and I've set it to admin, just so I have a couple different admin accounts I can use for logging in and demonstrating as we go forward, right? The other little thing, I did it already in our demo in Learning Moment 7, but here in the employee controller where we insert identity user, remember we set it up to use our great little password generator to make a random password meeting all the requirements there would be. But you know, what I was doing is setting a breakpoint here and actually replacing it with one I would know. I'm doing this because I don't want to have to bother with the whole forgot password, getting the email all set up and everything like that. So by using a predetermined password during the demonstration, it makes it easier for me. So maybe instead of stopping here every time or even replacing it, I'll just make a change here, right? So that we just initialize the password with the hard-coded one so I can know ahead of time what it is. Okay, that's just a bit of preparation for the demonstration itself in terms of setting up this new account and so on. Okay. All right, so as I note here, of course, push notifications are great, but a subscription really is an agreement between the client device, technically we can even say the client browser on the device, and the push service, right? So our job, really, it happens from the client inside the browser to the push service, basically looked after by the browser vendor. But what we're trying to do is piggyback on top of that and capture that information. So that's why there's a lot of kind of extra steps that seem, at first you're kind of wondering, well, why do we have to do all that? Well, it's so we can try and grab this information and save it. Remember, we talked about VAPID, the Voluntary Application Server Identification. Those are the keys that we use to identify and relate the push server and the push client, right? So let me just move this back off to the side. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to try and capture all those settings for the push notification and put them into our model. Remember, we made it already. Here's our subscription model, right? So there's 3 pieces of information that identify the actual push subscription. There's this push endpoint and so on, these other couple as well, the push P256DH, and then the auth. Anyway, so those are the 3 things we need to know to track the actual subscription. So we've made an entity that we'll store in our database and relating it back to the employee. So eventually the employee might have multiple subscriptions. They might set up and subscribe for notifications on their mobile device, as well as their desktop PC and so on. So that'd be separate subscriptions for each. And technically, if they did it in 2 different browsers on either device, well, each one of those would be a subscription as well, right? Okay, that's just how the system works. So we have to understand it so we can use it. So we already did these next steps. We added the I collection of subscriptions into the employee to relate it back and forth. And we created the subscriptions DB set and the DB context and so on, right? So that's all done. We got that done as we went through the last learning moment. So the next thing we must do is we need to install a NuGet package. And it's simply called web push, right? So we'll just install package web push. And you notice when we had our discussion a few minutes ago, one of the things that gets installed here is everything, all the plumbing for fully encrypting, okay, all the messages going back and forth, so there's no worry about hacking or anything like that in our push subscriptions. Okay, now, the whole thing builds upon or is part of, it's one of the options available because, as we said earlier, we turned our application into a progressive web app. And the main worker here that does the job for us is this service worker script, right? So we added this earlier on. So what we need to do is we have a bunch of listeners in here, right? And we're going to add a listener to handle push notifications. So I can just kind of put it anywhere in here. This will be fine. This is a decent spot. So there's two actual little nuggets of code here we're going to throw in. Okay, the event listener itself for push, right? And then this one here for notification click, right? Just to close the notification. So that's all at a minimum we have to add. Now you can expand on this. Notice we have three basic pieces of information here. The message, we can set up an icon and so on and so forth, right? So you see it's set for a given JPEG. Now I have this somewhere, but you know, maybe I'll just, we'll use one of our existing. It likes a JPEG, so I'm going to use one of our existing images. Hang on one second. Okay, actually I found it was easiest to open my Paint application, and I just did a save as of this image as a JPEG, right? So I've specified that's the name of the icon for my push notifications here. All right, let me just carry on then. Our next thing is in our application settings, okay, our JSON file, way down here. We need a new section. Now, truth is, we will be replacing this completely, but just to show you, I'll throw that in. Our VAPID keys, we have a public key and a private key, right? We talked about the VAPID keys, that basically the private key stays on the server, and then the public key, the idea is that is used on the client to help us relate the subscription back and forth. Okay, now speaking of working with the subscription, much of it is done with JavaScript on the client, because really this is really a client functionality that we're just piggybacking on top of inside of our server-based application, right? So let me come up here to the JavaScript folder. And now the truth is, each of these scripts I'm about to add technically relates or works with a single view, how we're going to set up our demo here, right? I could just put the code right in with the view itself, but I don't know. I kind of like the idea of keeping my JavaScript collected in one spot as much as is reasonable to do. I don't want to be overboard and insist on it all the time, but it makes sense to me as well if I might end up utilizing these scripts. You know, of course, some of them are referring to specific elements on the page, so if those elements aren't there, the script won't work. But, you know, it is opening up the possibility of reusing some of these scripts on more than one page eventually, if that is appropriate. But there's no real harm in adding them in here. So that's why I'm doing it. Kind of going on and on about this a little bit, but that's mainly because I've been asked why, right? So we're going to create a new item here. And that's my justification for it, you might say. Okay, web. So here we come down to a JavaScript file. So my first one is my check subscription JavaScript file, right? Now this is basically, at this point, only going to be used on the actual employee account details view, right? But we're going to store it here nonetheless. So what is involved in this? Well, there's a couple functions we're going to add in this JavaScript file, right? But basically the idea is we check if push is supported, and then we find out whether or not there is a subscription, right? And if we can basically say, nope, currently subscribed, and then we can say, or not subscribed, and you know, we can actually just change the feedback on the screen, again, inside the actual view itself, the details view for the employee account. That's when the employee goes in from their login menu, so to speak, to change their own settings, right? Okay. And then we can just give feedback there to the div on the page to say what the current status of their subscription is. All right, so that's good. That's one. Now let's add the next one. So I'll add yet another new item. Once more, a JavaScript file, but this one is going to be called Create Subscription. So this is the one that has most of the work in it, right? So this is right out of that tutorial, the online tutorial I referred you to. in terms of how to get your subscriptions in place and so on and so forth. So we're going to have methods here for subscribing, for unsubscribing, and then there's some little helper methods as well to do things like converting, a base64 string to a base64 array, integer array, and so on and so forth, right? Things that we need to actually get this carried out. Okay. All right, so again, if push is supported, we go in and we do the work that we have to get done. We have an unsubscribe method. And you notice it's all based about these particular properties, right? The push endpoints and so on and so forth, right? It's all about manipulating them. So let me just emphasize before we go on, we will have some buttons for submit, okay, and buttons for subscribe and unsubscribed and so on. And then that will tie into this functionality. But what it's going to do is it's going to create that subscription between the browser and the server. Our job will be to find some way to grab those values. And just quickly mentioning here, so we see that these are also going to be names or IDs of inputs on the page, right? So we're going to grab the values out of the inputs on the page and actually submit them, okay, in our JavaScript here back to our MVC controller. Right? That's how we'll grab this information that's generated on the client, submit it to the controller so we can then save it in the database. Okay, next, a small, tiny wee one here, another new item, another JavaScript file. It's simply called send push. Okay, we're going to use this for our quick demo of sending a push notification, right? So we're going to basically add a link right on the index view for the employees so that if they've subscribed to push notification, we can click this and say, hey, we're going to send a quick message to this particular user. Don't worry, we'll get into a more real-world example in the next learning moment. But this will just be a quick demonstration. All right. Okay, so I have my JavaScript files all in place and ready to go. They're right out of that tutorial. I made minor modifications just in terms of how I changed the background color of some of the displays and so on. All right, so we already have our employee view model, right? So let's just have a quick look here to make sure our view models in the employee view model. Okay, notice that we had this number of push subscriptions, okay? That's so that we can display that count of how many subscriptions they have. All right. And then we do need to do some additional work in the employee account controller. So coming up to that, employee account. Okay. Control MO, shrink it all down. So right at the top here, right, notice that the only thing we're injecting from dependency injection right now is our DB contact, our medical office contact. So I want something in addition. I need to be able to access the values in my app settings JSON, okay? Basically those VAPID keys, the public and private key. So what I'll do is I'll modify this so I'm also injecting our configuration, iConfiguration. And we'll use it when we need to access the actual keys for push notifications themselves. Okay. Now down here in the details action, remember the index just redirects, right? Redirect back to details. There's details was really the page that we're after here, right? So notice here's how we get our employee, including the subscriptions, okay? And where the email matches and so on and so forth. That's all something we did last term. But I'm going to take advantage here. The system will generate our VAPID keys for us. So they're unique, okay? We're the only application that will have the same VAPID keys. Nobody else can steal our code, et cetera, et cetera. So that only ever happens once, right? One time. And once we have those keys, we never need to change them unless for some reason we wanted to, right? But there's no need to. But we have to get them once. So I just thought in terms of how we get that, we'll just do it this one time. Oh, sorry, I copied them, didn't copy. Okay, so I'm putting code in here that I'll only ever use one time, but we're going to come to this view, obviously, and then that way, what it's going to do is it's going to check, do we actually have value for our public key, right? And if we don't, then I'm going to go to a little form, right? A little view where we're going to generate keys. Well, I have to do it once, and then I could take this code back out if I wanted to, right? Okay, so I think that's it. That's all I really have to do in here. Yeah, that's the only change to make. Okay, but still in the employee account controller, we're going to add a get and a post action for push, right? Okay, so maybe I'll put it after edit here. I'm going to grab both the get and the post together. Okay, so we'll have a view to correspond to this eventually as well. So here, our push view will go and we'll get it, but notice we have to supply an employee ID, right? This is for our demonstration of sending a push message to one selected employee, right? So we do need to go and get the public key, okay? We're going to add that into the view bag because they'll need that on the client side, right? And then the employee ID itself, we'll want to store that in the view that we're going to be bringing up. So it'll go into view data here, and then we just return view on our little push view, right? Now, after we fill it out and provide all the information that we want here, then we're going to come back to our push, our post for the push, and we will have generated on the client side values for the actual individual subscription. So all these values will be generated on the client, inserted into the actual form inside the web page. So then the submit action will send that data up here. So we'll be able to now build or create the subscription, the push subscription, right? We have the employee ID, the other three pieces of information needed to actually generate our subscription itself, right? Notice we're also going to track the submit button to know which one was submitted because it might be either subscribe or unsubscribe, right? Okay, so if it's unsubscribed, basically we go and we find the subscription in the database and we just do a remove, right? As long as it's already not been removed for some other reason, and save changes, and that's basically it. Else, okay, we're creating the subscription, okay? So as long as our model state is valid, we'll go in, we'll add the subscription that was passed up, right? I know I've said it a few times, I'm going to say it again. Remember, this is us piggybacking on top of the client-side process of generating these values so that we can actually have opportunity to save it in the database ourselves and know about the details of the subscription itself. Okay, so that's good. That's basically what we need there. Now, we'll need our generate keys action as well. Remember, we're going to call this one time only, single-use chunk of code, right, to get the actual view up, and we'll generate the VAPID keys, okay, and we'll store them in the view bag just to display up on the screen so we can copy them out of here and paste them into our app settings JSON. When we're done with that, we can get rid of this code, get rid of the view, etc., right? Okay. Next, we have to work on the views to correspond to this, right? So first of all, let's come down to views, employee account. So in the details view, right, we need to do a little bit of work here, okay? And yeah, I made a change to this div at the top. I wanted to be able to change the background color, so I modified my JavaScript code to do that. So I need to just make a little bit of a change there. I just made the class a simple alert, right? Actually, and I also gave it an ID. It didn't have an ID, this div itself, so that I could change the background color by changing the class. So that's a tiny, tiny little change there. And there's a bit more to do, though. Down at the bottom, we're going to add a link here, an action link, notifications on this device. Okay, so that does the get to our push action, passing the employee ID, right? Of course, this is the details for one given employee, so we'll pass the ID of the employee as necessary. And then we need a little bit of JavaScript here as well that will be merged, of course, into the script section on the layout, right? So we get our VAPID public key in place, and then we call that check subscription, the one we added earlier on. So that'll just let us know whether or not there is a subscription already for this browser on this client device, and then it'll automatically adjust what's displayed in this div up here, depending on if there is a subscription or not. Okay, so that's all the changes we need to make to the details to correspond with that. But coming back here, we obviously need a view to work along with this push, right? So I can right-click, add view, razor view, and as I've usually been doing lately, I'm just going to go with an empty one. Easy to do this code on your own, but I have it ready in my copy-paste file. Okay. All right. Manage push subscription. Okay. Again, I'm using an alert up top to give feedback if necessary. So our action is push. So after we fill this out, okay, it will actually submit it back to the push HTTP post action on the controller itself. But notice we have inputs here for those three pieces of information, the endpoint and so on. The trick is, of course, the actual values that will be filled into these inputs are going to be coming from JavaScript. Okay, we don't actually fill them in. The script that generates the subscription will fill them in, and then when we submit this, that's how it gets to the database for us to store it, right? So when we have two inputs down here, notice that they have a common name, button submit. Okay, the value is different. So that's why when this gets submitted in our code on the controller, we can check the value of button submit and know whether they click subscribe or unsubscribe. Of course, they have separate IDs to go along with that. Okay, now there's some script at the bottom here, of course. So we need to grab our public key, okay, and then we can either click our button unsubscribe or subscribe, and that in our create subscription, we saw quickly we had a look at the code in there earlier. So depending which of these we call, right, then we actually either create or remove the subscription, filling the data in and getting ready. We actually do the submit in JavaScript for the actual form itself. All right, we do need as well our tiny little form, our single-use form for generate keys, so I might as well add it the same way. Just it's our generate keys view, which we'll only need one time. Okay. All right, so we've generated the keys, so we pass them in the view bag down, and we're doing this just so we can copy and paste them and get them in place. You could do this in different ways, but I'm just following that tutorial I referenced earlier. So this is how it was set up for demonstration purposes. Or obviously, you wouldn't leave this there in a production application, but that's not the point of our demo. Okay, all right. Now, you know what? I think I might stop at this point, and then we'll go on to the employee controller in the next recording.